Hello and welcome as this week we come to the 13th Sunday or weekend of the church year. The readings this time, the first comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, and then chapter 2, verses 23 through 24, so just two verses there. Once again, the second reading is Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 7, 9, 13 through 15. So again, there's a little chopping there to kind of present the message of Paul. And finally, this time we come to the 5th chapter of Mark, and we will be listening to verses 21 through 43. Now, we remember last time we're crossing the sea, and the boat and all of that kind of story. Well, as chapter 5 begins, and this part we will not be hearing, but it perhaps is important to notice because there is a comparison between what happens, is that they land on the shore, okay, so now the boat comes, and they meet a man who is raging, running around, hurting himself, and this will be the story of what one might call the exercising of the piggy legion. All right, now let me give you will not be hearing this Sunday, but we should probably analyze it. They are now in the territory of the Gazarenes, and this man approaches Jesus. Now, what do we know about him? We hear a description that he has been raging, running around. He breaks chains, he foams at the mouth, he hurts, well, not so much others, but also himself. And those, of course, who like to be medical people here would point out that the description that Mark gives, and this is one of his longer descriptions, although the one we're going to look at here this time is also a longer description, because Mark, who likes to do things and then, without giving a lot of background, stops to give some very colorful stories. So here you have the kind of picturesque description of this man, whom some would point out is perhaps undergoing what would be called a grand mal. In other words, he is epileptic, he is going through a fit, and what Jesus then is pictured, by the way, as curing this man, okay? Now, as he attempts to cure him, the voices coming out, and of course he is pictured as kind of being demonically controlled, and of course that only adds to the story. When Jesus is about to heal him, the voice from within the man says, "Don't do this to us. Cast us into the sea." And that's exactly what Jesus does. He casts the demonic forces that are controlling. Well, they suddenly go into a whole flock of pigs, and the pigs go over a cliff and into the sea and drown. Oh, now, oh wow. Of course, we smile a little bit because the Jews would not be eating pork, and so the fact that the pigs go into the water also makes, as I've mentioned on other occasions, important to notice the humans here. But there's also something else at work here. And this particular episode pictures, well, now I've got to be careful here, but keep in mind that sometimes those who are engaged in policing, patrolmen, police, are sometimes, I know you would never do this, I would never call them that, pigs, but there might well have been this. And if therefore it was the Romans who were policing and controlling the territory both of the Gazarenes but also of Israel, wouldn't it be nice if at their own request they were cast into the sea? Now, we talked last time about the importance of the sea, Keep in mind here that the Romans believed that the Mediterranean, in fact, they called it our sea, so that they controlled much of the activities that happened in the Mediterranean Sea. So wouldn't it be interesting, although this is not the Mediterranean Sea, what body of water is this that they're thrown into? Again, remains a bit mysterious, but anyway, they're thrown into the sea, and that's what they deserve. They call it their own, and may they be drowned. So all of that is the episode that precedes this, and it is a tale in which obviously a man is healed. He wants to follow Jesus, and at the end of that story, Jesus says to him, "No, go back to your own people and tell them what the Lord has done for you," okay? The people, by the way, of the territory in which Jesus has healed this man, also ask him to leave because they're afraid if he stays any further, he may cause further economic harm to the region. So again, you can kind of see a number of dynamics that are incorporated as Mark tells the story of Jesus taking place. All right, so that's the episode that precedes the one that we're going to be looking at this time. So those are actually 1 through 20, so it's a number of verses that are included in this story. Now we come to Jesus' back, so we presume that he has crossed to the other side of the sea. Again, the sea here is the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is pictured as being at home, and he receives a message. Now, what we're going to see here is an example of what we call a technique that we've noticed before in Mark, that he likes to use, what is called the sandwich device. I think we've mentioned this before, and that we see it in a number of places, but that's what's going to happen here. You're going to find a sandwich means a story begins, then another story comes right before that one ends in the middle, and then the story that began is concluded, much like a sandwich, okay? So you have 2 loaves of bread on either side, and then the meat or peanut butter or whatever you have in the middle. All right, so this device in storytelling is very aptly at work here. So how does it begin? It begins that a man named Jairus, who is a synagogue leader. Now it's interesting that sometimes in the gospel, the Jews are often pictured as being opponents to Jesus. Now here is a man who favors what Jesus is doing. He's heard about him. And he comes to Jesus and he says, "Would you come? And my daughter is lying sick." Almost, you're not sure how serious the sickness is, but it is close to, well, death. Would he come and heal her? So that's the beginning of the story. We know that the man's name is Jairus. Now, interesting, and I don't know where to make some of the breaks here as we're developing this story, that this will be a story, or series, 2 stories that deal with women, both of whom the women are unnamed. Now, we know that she is Jairus' daughter, but we don't know her name. All right, on the other hand, as Jesus is now moving, one assumes, with some of his disciples and friends, they always seem to be around, moving toward the place where Jairus lives, now wherever the synagogue is, and again, we're not sure what the distance is here, but as they're going along, another woman who has been suffering from hemorrhaging for 12 years hears that Jesus is passing by and thinks, it's interesting that we get the kind of mentality of the woman here, if I but touch his cloak, perhaps I will be cured. So that's exactly what she does. As Jesus is passing through, she reaches out and touches Jesus. Now, having done that, keep in mind that she's putting things into a dangerous position, both for herself and for Jesus, because you remember that blood, the great sign of life, was also considered when going in the wrong direction as rendering one impure and therefore ritually not to be touched, okay? So this woman is, if you want, untouchable in the sense that she is, well, undergoing this bleeding. Now, it's also interesting, I have to, as I kind of pointed out so many times, the kind of humor in things, that this woman has been suffering from hemorrhaging for 12 years. She has gone to many physicians, and in fact, having gone to them, has come away not better, but worse. Now, can you imagine your doctor, when you go to visit him, have this little saying on his wall about the visit of to the doctor, that you're not getting better, but you're getting worse. So all of that is a kind of featured aspect of this story. Anyway, that's the background. So again, we get a little background of this woman, why she reaches out and touches Jesus. She is instantly healed. Now, Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Now remember, he's in a crowd, and good old disciples say to Jesus, look, there's a lot of people pushing and shoving here. How can you ask who has touched you? But what has happened is that a power that Jesus receives from the Father has been extended to the woman. So this is one of those interesting stories where a healing happens in which Jesus is not in charge or has control. We often think of everything happening. People ask Jesus for help or support. He gives it, and he, of course, is the one who engineers and extends what is being asked. That's not the case here. He never knew what the concern of the woman was. We know because we are privy to the narrative as it's unfolding, and we know her mind, but Jesus doesn't. So in that sense, he realizes that power has gone out from him. His disciples simply think, well, he's been touched by somebody, and that's what his question is. The woman, now realizing what has happened, comes to Jesus, falls down before him, and admits what she has done. Because by her touching him, in effect, she has also rendered him impure ritually. So this whole impurity stuff kind of lies behind these tales, and we, of course, don't pay a whole lot of attention to these things, but the contemporaries of the first century world did. All right, so this episode, now it's interesting here also to notice that we don't know how long this activity as Jesus is moving along took place. Did it happen within 5 to 6 minutes? Did it take maybe an hour or so for this full episode to unfold? Now, why do I mention this? Because they now pictured as continuing to Jairus' home, when in verse 35 here now, some messengers from this synagogue ruler's house come and say, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the master anymore?" Jesus says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just keep believing. And remember that the woman had been healed because of her tremendous faith. She had believed that Jesus was empowered by God to bring healing and had responded in an appropriate way. And Jesus had blessed her faith that God works. And maybe there was a hidden message that Mark had in mind, that the mystery of God's graciousness works in many kind of unexpected manners and ways. Anyway, Jesus encourages Jairus and comes to the house where the daughter is. There is a group standing there who are pictured as weeping and wailing. Now, we may have noticed this before, but it's one of the kind of characteristics of Jewish life that when someone dies, there were, I want to call them professional weepers, but there were women who engaged in this kind of activity, hoping in this way to ease the sorrow and the pain of those who had lost a loved one. So if the girl has been declared as dead, when Jesus arrives, says, well, what are you doing? He knows what they're doing. He says, she is not dead, but asleep. They kind of look at him and say, really? What does he know? So then Jesus goes into the house, takes with him his famous little trio, John, James, and Peter, and also the mom and dad of the girl, goes into the place where she is laying, puts his hand on her, keeping in mind that there's a lot of touching going on. Once again, if she were dead, Jesus has violated another ritual code by touching a dead person, but since Jesus had said she's not dead, well, you can see there was a difference, and says to her, teklika kom. Now this is one, that would be an Aramaic term. It's one of the few times that Jesus is pictured in the scriptures as actually using the language that would have been probably spoken by, by him and by many of his contemporaries. He lifts her up and then hands her, as it were, to her mom and dad. She now, and just to finish this episode, and then to go back a couple points that maybe we can make here. Notice the touching. Jesus said, "Who touched me?" In this case, he has touched her. As he concludes this episode, the fact that she is 12 years old. Now, some have noticed that the woman who suffered the hemorrhaging had been 12 years of suffering. So is there a connection here between the woman suffering something that rendered her untouchable and the daughter, 12-year-old, also dead, therefore rendered untouchable, has now, both of them have been, as it were, healed or raised. The term daughter is used, okay? Here she is, of course, the daughter of Jairus, but Jesus also uses the phrase when the woman who was cured of the hemorrhaging as daughter. So again, some have pointed out that that phrase is used. One, an older daughter, and the other, she is 12 years old now. What is the importance here? This young girl stands at the threshold of womanhood, okay? So remember that was the kind of age in which a girl passed from being a girl to a woman and a boy to becoming a man. All right? He then also says, give her something to eat. Now you have to smile and say, that Jesus perhaps really understood teenagers. Have you ever noticed that they always seem to be hungry? And so as this young girl is back to health, kind of makes this, offers this advice or command to the family. I often have to kind of smile at that. I'm not sure that Mark had that in mind, but anyway, it certainly would work here. So, 2 daughters of the Lord are healed. Let me take this opportunity here to point out that, in fact, in Mark's story, there are actually 4 times in which a daughter is mentioned. And there aren't a number, to his credit, Mark does include women at times into important episodes in the story, in the Markan story. All right, so I thought we could just quickly look. We will notice 2 of them later on, but just to mention them, to put this little in a box pattern of the 4 daughters of Mark. The first is, of course, the adult woman with the hemorrhaging of blood, never married, or we're not sure, was she divorced? Apparently has no children, so we kind of fill in some blanks with regard to this woman, because obviously she had to take care of herself and suffered because of it, being segregated because of the presence of blood. So that's the first daughter. The second daughter we also mentioned in this discussion is Jairus' daughter. She's young, she's unmarried, she's on the threshold of adulthood or womanhood, and so her whole future is before her. Interestingly, another characteristic in the Markan story is that Jesus is doing new things, often rejects what had happened in the past, and always looks for what should be the attention as we move forward. So this young woman, young girl, young woman, what is it, is on the threshold of life, and many of the possibilities of the future lie open before her. The third daughter mentioned in this gospel is the daughter of Herodias. Now, this story is found in chapter 6, particularly verses 22 through 29. You'll remember that Herodias had come under the scorn and attack of John the Baptist because she had been married to Philip and now was the wife of Herod. And she bore a grudge, you remember, against John the Baptist for what he was doing and what he had said to her. And on one occasion, this famous story, I don't think we will be hearing it in the gospel, but that is on the Sunday readings, but nevertheless is one of an episode in which a daughter plays an important role, comes in, and again, this is colorfully described in Mark's story, does a dance when Herod is celebrating, one believes it was his birthday, an important occasion, and he invited a number of important people to this celebration. And he now says to the girl, once her dance, and great artists have developed this, but we don't know what the dance was. But anyway, the dance apparently pleased Herod, and he says to her, "Ask whatever you want, even to half my kingdom." So in this episode, there is, again, Old Testament references. This half of my kingdom had been kind of promise also made to Esther in one of the Old Testament stories when she had done something to please the king. Anyway, you remember that this daughter asks for the head of John the Baptist at the advice of her mother, and the head of John is brought in on a platter. Can only picture the young daughter as accepting it and giving it to her mother. So that's the third daughter who's mentioned. And the fourth daughter appears in chapter 7, when what is known as a Syrophoenician woman approaches Jesus and says, "My daughter is very ill at home. Would you please cure her or come and help her?" Now, I'll give this story, but we'll probably develop this a little bit at a later date. Jesus kind of at first says, "No, I won't do it," but Jesus is reminded by the Syrophoenician woman that even those who are kind of the unlikelies deserve to receive the graciousness and goodness of God. And at this point, from a distance, so Jesus does not, in this case, touch, as in the stories that we've been looking at this time, touch the woman's daughter, but heals her. So this is the fourth of particularly named daughters in Mark's story. So I mention this because as we're looking at the tradition of Mark this year, some of the kind of unique characteristics that fit this gospel, they would be in some ways also picked up by Matthew and Luke, but in this case, really a kind of interestingly developed by this gospel writer. So what we have looked at this time has been an example of, notice this kind of sandwiching technique. Notice the ways in which Mark has linked these two episodes: women, untouchable, daughters, healing, faith. In this case, the faith is found in the woman who is the bleeding woman. We're not quite sure what the faith of Jairus' daughter was. I have to admit there that it is Jairus who has the faith that Jesus can do this. Anyway, we have looked at different ways in which Mark has included women. Just in conclusion, this, by the way, was the third episode in which women were included. Prior to this, you remember, Jesus had cured the mother-in-law of Peter, had gone into her house. She had been sick, and that had been a healing that Jesus did. And then the other mention of mothers and sisters had been, remember, in the episode that we also looked at a couple of weeks ago, where the family of Jesus had come because they didn't like what he was doing. And the phrase had been, your mother, your brother, and your sisters are standing outside. And Jesus had said, "Who are my mother and my daughters, but those who accept my word and follow it." So, in fairness to Mark, the presence of women in the ministry of Jesus is incorporated. Now, I mention this because for a number of centuries, little attention has been paid to that, and I have to smile that some of the most important interpreters of the New Testament in our time have been wonderful women scholars, and they have been helpful in bringing to the attention of those who read the Gospels their presence. So those of you who maybe are watching here can smile and say, well, although it still is pretty much a patriarchal society, nevertheless, in the band of those who made up the ministry of Jesus would be included women. One of the other Gospels, not this one, points out that these women helped sustain the ministry of Jesus out of their own means, which would have probably indicated that they had certain wealth. Well, all of that is part of a background for this week's look at Jesus healing, touching, and bringing the gift of God to those in need. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.